Some true crime stories, they stick with you. And it's not always just because of the tragedy, but because of these strange, almost surreal details that just don't make sense. We're talking missing students, computers that get mysteriously wiped, and bizarre religious cults. Today, we're going to dive into 5 cases that just absolutely defy any easy explanation. So, what is it that makes a case truly unforgettable? I mean, really stick in your mind. It's usually not the who or the why, but the unsettling how, right? It's those loose ends, the bizarre clues, the chilling coincidences that just refuse to fade away, the details that seem to defy all logic. So, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the chilling stories of young people who basically vanished into thin air. Then we'll unravel a family mystery that somehow spanned 4 whole decades. From there, we'll look at cases where the justice system itself kind of fell apart. And finally, we'll wrap up by thinking about the lingering questions these stories force all of us to ask. Okay, so our first theme, it really hits on one of the most terrifying scenarios you can imagine. A young person heads out for a perfectly normal night, and then they just never come home, leaving behind this trail of confusing, desperate clues. This is Adrien Salinas. She was 19, a community college student in Arizona who dreamed of being a journalist. But back in June of 2013, after a party and an argument with her boyfriend, her life story took this incredibly tragic and mysterious turn. Just look at this timeline of her last known hours. It paints this picture of just escalating desperation. She leaves her apartment, has a minor car accident, then she gets to a convenience store, and for the next 35 minutes she makes 11 unanswered calls to her boyfriend. 11. Can you even imagine that growing panic? Then, at 5:07 a.m., her phone goes dark, and she's just gone. 2 months later, the worst possible news was confirmed. Her remains were found out in the desert. The autopsy couldn't determine a cause of death. Police think an opportunistic killer saw her stranded and vulnerable. But they have no suspect. And that means the person responsible for her death is still out there. Adrien's case is so baffling, but what's terrifying is that she's not alone in these kinds of circumstances. A really similar mystery surrounds 20-year-old Joshua Guimond. Back in 2002, he left a party at his university in Minnesota for what should have been a simple 3-minute walk back to his dorm. He never made it. This is one of those cases where this simple explanation just doesn't sit right, because it seems to hide a much darker reality. The official theory was pretty straightforward. He was drinking, he stumbled, and he fell into a freezing lake. Plausible, right? Except they did extensive searches. They even lowered the lake's water level and found absolutely nothing. And then, the darker clues started to surface. His computer was tampered with after he disappeared. Files were deleted. It came out that he'd been using a fake female persona to chat with unknown men online. And when you realize other young men had also vanished in that area, yeah, the simple theory starts to fall apart. Big time. Some mysteries don't just stay cold forever. They thaw out, decades later, with the most incredible revelations. Our next case is absolutely one of those, centering on a family that was torn apart by a secret that was kept for 42 years. I mean, just look at this timeline. It shows a mystery that unfolded over 4 entire decades. So in 1980, this young couple, Dean and Tina Clouse, they vanished with their baby daughter, Holly. A year later, 2 bodies are found, but they can't be identified. For 40 years, their families search for answers. Then, a huge breakthrough in 2021. Forensic genealogy finally identifies the bodies as Dean and Tina. But the biggest question of all was, where was baby Holly? And then, incredibly, in 2022, she was found, alive, and well. 42. That's how old Holly was when she finally learned her real name and the true story of her parents. An entire lifetime lived with absolutely no idea about the tragedy that had defined her family for 2 generations. Just wow. And this quote from a family member, it just perfectly captures that brutal emotional whiplash. I mean, after 41 years of not knowing, they finally get an answer. But that answer is the confirmation of their absolute worst nightmare. It's closure and horror, all in the same breath. So how in the world was Holly found? Well, the answer only makes this mystery even deeper. Investigators found out that she'd been dropped off at a church in Arizona by 2 barefoot women in white robes who said they were from some nomadic religious group. The church, having no idea about the real circumstances, arranged her adoption. Finding Holly was a miracle, but it opened up this whole new can of worms about this group, and their connection to her parents' murders is still completely unsolved. Sometimes the most haunting part of a story isn't the crime itself, but the terrible mistakes that happen afterward. In this next section, we're going to look at two cases where police got tunnel vision, investigations were flawed, and innocent men ended up taking the blame while the real killers just faded into the background. So in 2011, Richard Oland, who was an heir to the huge Moosehead Brewery fortune up in Canada, was found bludgeoned to death in his office. And it was an incredibly brutal scene. We're talking 45 separate blows. The police immediately looked close to home, and they focused right in on his only son, Dennis. Now, the case against Dennis Oland rested on the absolute thinnest of evidence, just 4 microscopic bloodstains on his jacket, completely invisible to the naked eye. That's it. And yet, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. His conviction was later thrown out on a technicality, and in a retrial, he was found not guilty. So what's the result? Dennis Oland lost years of his life, and his father's brutal murder is still unsolved to this day. The Oland case really highlights a justice system's failure. But our next story is one of Canada's most infamous wrongful convictions. Back in 1984, after 9-year-old Christine Jessup was abducted and murdered, the investigation quickly zeroed in on her neighbor, a quiet, kind of quirky man named Guy Paul Morin. Okay, let's just walk through this timeline of pure injustice. Guy Paul Morin is convicted and sent to prison. He fights for 10 years until 1995, when new DNA testing finally proves his innocence. The case then goes cold for another 25 years. Then, in 2020, genetic genealogy points to the real killer, a man named Calvin Hoover. And this is the part that is just bone-chilling. Hoover wasn't a stranger. He was a friend of the Jessup family. He had even helped search for Christine after she went missing. He was hiding in plain sight the entire time. After more than a decade of screaming his innocence from a prison cell, you can just feel the weight lifting in his words. DNA technology, which wasn't even available during his trial, finally gave him his life back. It's such a powerful moment of vindication after a colossal failure of justice. So after exploring all these cases of people who vanished, of secrets buried for decades, and of justice gone completely wrong, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do these specific stories grab hold of us so much? Why can't we look away? I think it really boils down to a few key things. First, we see how technology is this total double-edged sword. It can deepen a mystery, like with Joshua Guimond's hidden online life, but it can also provide miraculous answers decades later, like it did for the Clouse family. Second, these cases are a really stark reminder that our justice system can fail, and fail badly. And finally, it's just the power of the bizarre. It's the nomadic cult, the 11 unanswered phone calls, the killer joining the search party. Those are the details that take a sad story and turn it into an absolutely unforgettable mystery. Which really just leaves us with one last thought. These stories, they push the boundaries of what we think is possible. They challenge our assumptions about the world and the people in it. So when the facts are this strange, this unsettling, and this contradictory, what do we choose to believe?